part of a broader permit process. Helps make a decision, should this project move forward? Does it show a net positive economic benefit to the communities? Really, that's what DNR wants to know. In the socioeconomic context, I'm not talking environmental. The study that I was talking about is prescriptive. Taking that information and translating the data into something that you can use. The number of housing units, taxation and revenue, impacts to municipal services, impacts to transportation infrastructure. If you understand what those impacts are, you can address those impacts or capitalize on those impacts. This isn't necessarily negative or positive. It's intended to be entirely neutral, but it provides the data for you to use. The regulatory requirements, okay? The EIR is completed as part of that broader environmental impact statement process. It has no regulatory significance per se. So the socioeconomic component of the environmental impact report is not regulatory in and of itself. The study that I was talking about, again, it's not regulatory either. But this project would provide all of the necessary information to complete the socioeconomic component of an environmental impact report. The level of detail, and here is where things become quite different. We talk about the level of detail in the socioeconomic context of the environmental impact report. As I mentioned, there are recommendations, there are guidelines, but there are no hard and fast rules. There's not a document that says under each item, whether it be population impacts, or transportation impacts, or economic development impacts, to quantify what those changes are going to be. Recommendations, and that's it. Well, that really isn't what we were looking at, what we wanted to do. We wanted to do something comprehensive, something that provides you with sufficient detail to make decisions. It's a planning tool. And that's the question I posed to Larry. Would you say the socioeconomic component of an EIR is a planning instrument? No. It's to help us make the determination of whether or not this project provides a net positive economic benefit. That's the key difference here. One is a planning instrument, one is done to fulfill obligations for the Department of Natural Resources. The timing. Well, that EIS or that EIR process is part of the overall permitting process, and I don't know what the timing is on that. But I do know that the timing for the process that I was talking about is about 6 to 8 months. Okay, so we have a definite time frame. Public involvement. Well, EIR is not participatory. It's not a publicly participatory process. It's a report. It's developed, it's submitted, and it's reviewed. There is a comment period that goes with these documents, but it's not a participatory process. What I was talking about doing is a participatory process. It needs to be, because we need to identify community priorities. All right? Community involvement. Again, the same thing. There's a public participatory process, there's a community participatory process, but not as part of that environmental impact report. How about providing a basis for negotiation? Well, the data that comes in an EIR, yeah, maybe. But we wouldn't know that until we knew what the level of detail was, right? If you don't know how much detail you're going to receive, it may or may not be suitable for negotiation. It may just be information. The impact study that I was proposing, yes, it has to be. It has to be suitable for negotiation. It has to be a tool that you can use. It has to be verifiable and done in a methodology that can be replicated, improved. How about provide a basis for community amendments to the comprehensive plan? Well, that was one of the intentions. Provide a basis for you to review and amend the community's comprehensive plan to take a broad look at the impacts of this project over time. And provide a basis for local regulatory changes. non-mine related. Regulatory changes to address impacts. In other words, new growth. And zoning ordinances that maybe need to be revised to accommodate new growth. The basis for doing that was part of the scope of work in that original impact study. But that's not part of DEIR necessarily. Okay? So this really encapsulates the differences between what I was talking about and the socioeconomic context of an environmental impact report. When you look through the ones that have been developed, they're highly variable. It could be addressed in a paragraph, the issue. It could be addressed over several pages, but without specific qualitative requirements, it's left to the individual, the corporation that develops that EIR, to put in the level of detail that they feel is sufficient. All right? So we're talking about very different processes here, with very different intentions and very different outcomes. Any questions about this? None? Okay. Now,
I think we have a pretty good grasp of the difference between what the DNR requires in their statement and what we're looking at trying to gain information about so that we can interpret that.
well, here's where we're going to talk about a little bit different context. How many of you have heard of an opportunity assessment? No one?
But it sounds good.
It sounds good? That's what I was hoping you'd say. In thinking about that original project and that scope of work and the outline that we used, you're really thinking about what is the intention here? What are we trying to accomplish? What we're trying to accomplish is setting forward a community development framework for Iron County for the future. Right? Something that gives you the information you need to build a long-term sustainable economy. Because mining isn't forever, but your economy and drawing people to this region and being prosperous, that's got to go on forever, right? Sustainable. Before I get into the discussion on this, I want to just mention something. I was going through reams of statistical information in my office, looking back at the mining history of Iron County. We've got old newspaper clippings, old studies, old population models. I just wanted to really get a feel for it. What happened when those mines closed? And I'll tell you, it's interesting. Part of it's pretty easy to see. Look at the population. 10,000, handful of people. What do we got now? 5,900? Last 10 years, lost 13.2% of your population. In 10 years, that's pretty amazing. But even a more amazing statistic is that there are 3 towns in Iron County that basically provide 70% of your overall taxation revenue. Mercer, Sherman, and Omaha. Is that surprising? Okay. One thing I'd like you to consider is it's the shoreline component that's driving that. Right now, the baby boom generation is that generation of second homeowners. The group that has fueled shoreline development. The group that comes after them, the millennials, has an entirely different set of values. They're technology driven. They're urban. They're mobile. And they don't necessarily represent the cabin culture of the past. What does that mean for Sherman, Mercer, and Omaha? I don't know. But as a demographer, it's an interesting concept. It's an interesting thought. If there are big transitions in shoreline and valuation, what is that going to do to tax revenue? 30 years from now, 35 years from now, when that generation is retiring, are they going to be buying the homes? Are they going to be filling the second homes? something worth thinking about. And at that point, how much money are you going to have in terms of revenue to support community development? And I don't mean to paint a bleak picture, but it's a trend that we're going to face and an issue that we're going to face all across the North. And it's up and coming. I just wanted to make you aware of that because we're talking about long-term community development. We have potential issues down the road. We have issues right now with population loss and retention of youth and attracting business and industry. But we have an opportunity. And that opportunity is what I've highlighted in this process. Okay? So let's go through it. And I'm not going to read this to you. I'll just highlight some of the key points. The first thing is the issue statement. Mining can play a central role in sustainable community development by acting as a catalyst for positive growth and social change in our county, an area that otherwise has limited opportunities for economic and social development. And those opportunities may be decreasing because of what I just mentioned, because the changes in demographics alone are creating issues. An opportunities assessment is a way of looking at a project as an opportunity and laying a framework for addressing that opportunity. Again, it's not pro or anti, it's just the context in which you're looking at. The intent would be, much like what I talked about earlier with the impact assessment, is to identify a long-term community development framework and a strategy which is supported by mining activities, and have the conversation, and the conversion of local non-renewable capital into sustainable human capital. Provide a framework for redrafting community plans. It's the same focus. This project would be community-driven. It would be a collaborative effort to identify short and long-term activities and development opportunities. And I think this is key here, as this process moves beyond the traditional donor-recipient model of community relations as it relates to community development programs, mining operations, and mining companies. Look at what's occurred in Minnesota, in Michigan. Look at the mining companies that are active in those communities, because they are active. They support community development. We can assume, and we hope it's the case, that we would have a similar situation here. An institution that supports community growth and community development and is active in the community. So this type of process would not only involve mining companies, it would necessitate participation by mining companies. So you would have a representative as part of the process. It's again a mutual process. What is the data that would be required? Well, much like the impact assessment, we have to have baseline information. We have to have a starting point. If we're going to talk about capitalizing on economic change, we have to know how much economic change to expect and what sectors that change is going to occur in. How much revenue can we expect to have to work with? And how can we involve the mining company as a partner in community development? Who participates? Well, as I mentioned, first and foremost, it is a developer, a mining company, local government, Iron County, citizens, stakeholder groups. And you see I've listed those: tourism and recreation, economic development, civic, and the youth. To work collaboratively to identify where your priorities are. And I go back to what I was doing in my office and going through all that material. How much investment went into Iron County's infrastructure, went into community development as a result of mining back in the 20s, 40s, through the 60s? Not much. Not much. But this is 2014, and things are done quite differently today than they were in the past. Today, mining companies work in conjunction with communities to support community development. And that's what I'm getting at in terms of an opportunity assessment. We're not looking at this and saying it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, but we're looking at it as how do we make this activity sustainable for our community and enhance our economic base so that we're self-sustaining, so that we can continue to grow beyond the closure of a mine. How do we do this? Well, use a participatory planning model with interviews, surveys, focus groups. Bring people together, bring the economic development sector together with all the other stakeholders in the community, and especially the young people, and talk about what do you want to see, what do you need to see as we go down the road. What needs to change? Do we need job training programs? Do we need to invest in municipal infrastructure? Do we need to invest in housing, education? And how do we do that? Going back to that previous situation, mine revenues received by communities were largely used on a reactive basis. They have money coming in, taxation revenue coming in. Let's just address the nearest issue on our radar screen. That works fine in some cases, but it's a very, very poor model of community development. Very poor model, because it's not based on a plan, and a plan that emphasizes sustainability. Goals and objectives need to be created. A current community development needs and priorities inventory needs to be assembled. Have to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses, understand what our capabilities are for building a sustainable community. Assess our skills, organizational and institutional resources, figure out what we have available today, what we need to have in the future, and define and explain the obstacles to community development. Because that's what we're going to try and overcome. By going through this process, we're trying to overcome the demographic challenges that we're faced with. And we're using this project as a vehicle to support that. If you turn to the next pages, you see a graphic, several graphics, that really kind of encapsulate what I'm envisioning this process would look like. And the first part of it is, of course, identifying those community development issues. And you see I have a number of those issues listed. There are physical infrastructure issues, economic issues, social issues. But we have to have baseline data. And here's where this really melds with that initial impact analysis. Regardless of the approach that we use, we have to have baseline data. So whether it's through an impact study or a partial study to provide supporting data to do an opportunity assessment, either way, we've got to have baseline information. We have to know what we are up against and what we will be up against in the future. The second part is we have to assess the community strengths and weaknesses, and you'll see I have those listed. And these aren't necessarily comprehensive by any stretch. But like any strategic planning process, there has to be a mechanism within there to take a realistic look at your community and say, yeah, there are some areas where we're not healthy. We don't have the resources. We can't provide adequate levels of service. And that's a deficiency that we need to address because it limits our ability to attract new growth, new population. The third part of this is identify community development priorities. And I think that's the top of this pyramid. That's the big part of this process. There hasn't really been an effort to identify a community development priority list in Aaron County. There's the SEDS. How many of you are familiar with the SEDS? One. It's a Community Economic Development Strategy. It's part of a regional planning process, and it's project lists that are submitted to, is it HUD? And what it is, it's a list of random projects. It can be anything from municipal sewer replacement to roads and bridges and culverts. It's not community development. Not at all. we're talking about something that is very, very structured.